Hello, I am Tony Walker, and I am the host of the Classic Ghost Stories podcast, and this week I'm going to be reading for you The Lodger in Room 16 by David Dixon. There is nothing artificial about me, nothing intelligent. I am human, all too human. I'm a long way from the music singularity. Everybody die, don't they? The Lodger in Room 16 by David Dixon. There was something rather odd about the lodger in room 16, and Mr. Finch didn't think he could stand any more of it right now. He was stooped at the keyhole of his next-door neighbor, like a huge bald-headed bird looking for worms. But all he could see was the corner of a crude, hefty wooden table, which told him nothing. It has not told him on many previous inspections. His innate timidity restricted his investigations to the daylight hours, when he knew the lodger must be out. And it was only during these hours that he tried the door. It was always locked. A little later, Mr. Finch left the lodging house in a very determined frame of mind. He walked briskly in a district of empty warehouses and dilapidated buildings. Evening was drawing in. The streets were always deserted after dark, due jointly to marauding packs of vandals and a strange series of disappearances which had plagued the area for years. This suited Mr. Finch perfectly. He had on a black overcoat 2 sizes too big for him and which he seldom took off, and pebble-glass spectacles that magnified his eyes to look like slugs wallowing. Darkly in axle grease he was anting for. He always tended to walk faster than he was fit, for it was trying to rain. Mr. Finch had a rolled-up newspaper under an arm when he returned to the lodging house. Some 10 minutes later, a bar of yellow light beneath the door of the ground-floor stairs betrayed the presence of the landlord within. Mr. Finch delivered one startling rap on the door with a knuckle. "Go away," commanded a muffled voice. Mr. Finch stood his ground. He waited to hold minutes patiently, then delivered a second stunning rap on the door. There followed a muffled curse, and the door was snatched open. The landlord glared down at the bent bird-like figure before him, whose spectacles reflected the light of the room to look like dim headlamps in its face. "Well," he barked impatiently. Mr. Finch insinuated himself into the room, which was packed to the ceiling with a scruffy and rusty collection of junk. The landlord shut the door with unnecessary loudness as Mr. Finch explained his visit. "I wish to speak with you, Mr. Morton, about certain disturbances on the top floor which are making my stay here difficult." "I haven't the time for it," snapped the landlord, "if I remember correctly." "Mr. Finch, you took that room on the understanding that if it wasn't to your satisfaction, you'd find another elsewhere. That's my understanding of the matter, Mr. Finch. And I'll thank you to remember that you demanded that room and made a nuance of yourself about it, after I told you them rooms up there wasn't fit for letting. And I'll thank you to remember that I didn't show you the top floor or offer you a room anywhere you found it yourself. Nevertheless, Mr. Morton, these disturbances must stop," said Mr. Finch with determination. "I don't know what number 16 is up to, but I think that as the landlord, you should be concerned about it. I believe that something is being willfully, maliciously destroyed in there at night, sometimes as much as 3 times a week, sir. There seems to be a crank-handled device in there, which sounds rusty to me, Mr. Morton, and the machine's task involves a sound that I can only describe as that of crunching sticks. Crunching sticks, Mr. Mole, is as near as I can describe it. In fact, it was intolerable. The disturbances always lasted about 45 minutes and were thunderous. The shuddering noise seemed to interfere with every atom of Mr. Fay's body. They could occur on any night and at any hour after dark. Mr. Finch feared most of all those that happened in the small hours when his sleep would be troubled by appalling dreams, and he would wake in a cold sweat in the dark and find himself listening to that infernally chilling sound. The scraping, ponderous turn of the crank handle and the sound of crunching sticks. The paranoid degree of anxiety that he felt at those times seemed to bring him to the brink of insanity. Is that all you wanted to say, Mr. Finch, indeed? I believe I hardly need say more to arouse your professional concern, Mr. Morton, then. No doubt you'll be anxious to leave, said the landlord, turning to the door. Let's not go poking our nose into other people's business. Mr. Finch, the man in number 16, works in a local cemetery and would not be pleased at your interest in his affairs. I have no doubt you took that room on the understanding that if you had any complaints, you'd find another elsewhere. My advice is to do just that. But wait a moment, Mr. Finch protested. Now, said the landlord, helping him out through the door. That's all I got to say on the matter, and that's that. Back in his room, with the door locked, Mr. Finch stood at his window thoughtfully. The view here was cluttered with archaic roofs and chimneys of various sizes and shapes, and part of a cinema could be seen. Amidst them, its neon signs lighting up his face, dimly pink, then blue, then pink again. After trying the crossword, Mr. Finch took his Daily Telegraph apart and changed some of the old newspaper sheets on his bed. With it he worked by the glow of the cinema signs. If we like to save on electricity, he went to bed much later with a sick lump of dread in his stomach and slept fitfully all night. The house remained tomike in its silence, however, and this was not what Mr. Finch had expected. The following morning he rose in a very grim mood, for the constant dread of nights was becoming insufferable. Though the disturbances were by no means regular, the lapses between them never exceeded 5 nights, and last night had been the 5th. He would have to look forward to a disturbance all over again, this time with the certainty of no reprieve. Mr. Finch was furious. He brushed his teeth venomously in the 4th-floor bathroom, and after a WTH full shave emerged in a gloomy corridor with small pieces of pink lavatory paper pressed on his bleeding jowls. The fact that the man worked among the dead and committed God knew what crimes after dark did not frighten Mr. Finch a bit. Now that he was angry, when he got back to his room, he wrote out a very stiff note in which he advised the recipient that should the disturbances continue, he would have no further recourse but to notify the police. He slipped a note under the door of number 16 and waited perfunctorily for signs of response. Of course there were none. He tried the door, but it was locked. He then left the lodging house to pick up his dole money, for it was Thursday. He bore a plastic carrier bag that contained library books due for replacement. It was dark when he returned, and it was trying to rain again. Behind the lodging house was a pitch-dark cobbled square. It lay by the side of a road that fortunately was well enough lit on the other side of the road to the square. Mr. Finch emerged from a beaten path that was crowded by trees and wild vegetation. The bank of verdure at his right screened a cemetery of considerable age, reputedly, though it couldn't be connected with his next-door neighbor, since it had been abandoned to riotous vegetation long ago. The soil here smelt overpoweringly rich and nutritious, and the wild weeds beyond the trees were gigantic, with stems as thick as Mr. Finch's wrists. Walking briskly, Mr. F. appeared into the square, where he met with something of an accident, for he had forgotten that the dust bins belonging to the buildings on the 3 sides of the square were always strung across its center. He'd forely complained of this to the landlord on many occasions, for it constituted a danger. At night he'd even been able to describe a lodger whom he believed guilty of placing the obstruction, a small mad-looking skeleton of a man with shrived eyes and a dry, cynical voice, who in the summer always walked down to the newspapers in overcoat pajamas and slippers. Mr. F's collision was thunderous. He was just getting the hang of his prostate circumstances when a sash window slammed open above the light of the obscured street lamp nearest the square, flooded over a wall and illuminated a double-barreled shotgun as it peered furtively out of a window. Halfway up the back of one of the lodging houses, the dry, hairless head of Mr. Finch's dustbin suspect appeared cautiously behind the weapon. "Who goes there?" it barked. Mr. Finch conveyed his identity and circumstances with restrained exasperation and announced that he would deliver a written complaint to the landlord about the dustbins. "You leave them. Bloody dustbins," the old man retorted with hostility. "I saw someone coming out by that old cemetery down there just now. Mr. Finch and I have got this ear notion. Maybe it was you. You keep well away from that place. That's my advice to you, having by now regathered his library books and repositioned his spectacles." Mr. Finch remained politely to inquire what the devil the madman was talking about. If you can't take advice without asking bloody questions all the time, you don't bloody. "Well, Des deserve any. I've been here a long time, Mr. Feet, and I got a sharp eye in my head that there is the devil's graveyard. A war betide any man that gets his cell buried in it." Mr. Finch assured the old man that he had no intentions of being interred there. "You just hope and pray that that might be the case, and God be thanked," said the old man, darkly. "For there is a great evil at large in this godless neighborhood, with folks being nicked out of their very beds. Of a night these many years," he added, crossing himself feverishly. "And what does this devil look like then?" Mr. Finch inquired contemptuously. "Does he have horns, like the books, Abbott the Tail?" "He don't look healthy," Mr. Finch said the old man with a shudder. "And that's no exaggeration. He's horribly fat and gray. He looks rotten. Mr. Finch, soft and rotten, like an over-R plum. And then there's his head. What's wrong with that?" "I don't like to think on it," said the old man with horror. "You keep well away from that place. That's my advice to you. You'll be good enough to set that dustbin up before you go else. I'll not rest peaceful in my bed tonight, Mr. Finch." Couldn't stand this old man whose personal abandon and madness represented the very depths of human degradation. Indeed, it was only with the noisiest taste in his mouth that he was able to associate with anybody reduced to living in a house of this quality. He was fortunate with the timing of the disturbance that night. Instead of having to wait up half the night in order to avoid having his sleep poisoned with it, he had to listen to it somewhat before midnight, while the cinema lights were still on. The sound began with a familiar scraping. Screech of what Mr. Finch took to be a crank handle. This continued at brief, regular intervals, punctuating the ceaseless, muffled, crunching sticks noise, which then commenced thereafter after Mr. Finch's room was filled and ravaged by the physical presence of noise. The dust on the floor rose up and hung like a ground mist over the floorboards. Mr. Finch found it hard to believe that nobody beneath heard this racket. And once again the inevitable question rose in the thunder. What on earth was his neighbor doing in there? Even through the rubber soles of his slippers, he could feel the BS throb in a rhythm with the activity in the next room. The vibration would deaden his ankles soon into an unaccountable numbness, and the dust would scour his lungs in exasperation. Mr. Finch did something he had often thought of doing before, but in the dark hours had always lacked the character, for he took almost 2 minutes to turn the key in his door as noiselessly as possible, and crept down the corridor to the door of room. Music. 16. The sound here was so quiet that until he reached the door, he suspected that it might have stopped. The door glowed dimly around its edges, and at the keyhole, Mr. Finch stooped and applied his eye to the keyhole. The light within was tremulous, and its unsteadiness seemed to increase and subside with the scraping turn of the crank handle. Mr. Finch thought it might be that of a candle, and wondered why his neighbor didn't use his electricity. The view was dominated by the corner of the crude table, as was to be expected. But Mr. F's attention was drawn by something else, something that he couldn't quite get the hang of. At first it overhung the edge of the table a little and seemed to be of an apricot hue with bluish discoloring. It was badly crumbled. Mr. Finch thought it might be made of some kind of flexible rubber. It wobbled and vibrated with the same throbbing rhythm as that of the unseen candle, and it sometimes advanced jerkily down over the edge of the table, which seemed to strain to the same rhythm, though it appeared to be stoutly made. Mr. Finch wondered if the rubber thing might be some kind of long-sleeved glove, since he suspected that he could make out the fingers. But as the sleeve grew longer and longer, he became doubtful he didn't like the texture of it at all. He remained long enough to watch the scene shudder and strain once more, and to see the rubber oddity on the table make one further jerky reach for the bottom of his field of view. Then he rose to go. Unfortunately, he applied his weight to the door handle, for his back was not what it had been when his weight was at its greatest. He lost his grip, the handle made a thunderous clunk in its housing, and Mr. Finch found to his stunned alarm that the door stood 6 in ajar. It opened to the left, so that he could see nothing of his neighbor. But it was clear that Estrud, his neighbor, was aware of his presence and had stopped work. Mr. Finch could hear quite plainly now the slow wheezing respiration of the man inside, who sounded grotesquely fat and bronchial. Mr. Finch had never previously heard so much as a footstep of him. It occurred to him that he might enter and communicate his grievances in person. And it was no doubt this very idea which precipitated his hasty retreat, in which he cared little for the racket he made. He locked his doorway and drew his armchair against it. Stood by his window, perhaps because it presented a comforting token of egress. While waiting, his dimly blue, then pink, then blue face was frozen with apprehension. After a few minutes, however, the grinding scrape of the crank handle announced the resumption of his neighbor's mysterious labors, and Mr. Finch opened his window to let in some fresh air. The following day, he descended the dark stair flights in a very determined frame of mind. "Indeed, what the devil do you want?" Now the landlord snarled, snatching open his door. I wish to speak to you about that man in room 16, said Mr. Finch firmly. He tried to insinuate himself into the landlord's room, but physical obstruction on the latter's part kept him out. Mr. Finch could see dozens of food mixers in their boxes stacked up amongst the cluttered junk within. Mr. Morton was in the habit of receiving at regular intervals, usually at night, large consignments of cassette radios, watches, and other valuables of this kind, and furtive men visited him frequently. Mr. Finch had never been in any doubt, but that Mr. Morton had business of dark merit and doubtful honor on the side. I think I already told you to keep your nose out of his affairs, Mr. Finch, and if you had any brains, you wouldn't forget it so easy. Mr. Finch was determined not to be offended. As I was going to say, this man started his disturbance last night, and I looked through the keyhole and observed candlelight in the room. Mr. F.E. proceeded to describe what he had seen through the keyhole. He didn't mention how he had accidentally opened the door, nor the threatening note he had rashly delivered, which now weighed so heavily on his peace of mind. I suspect that something is being willfully and maliciously destroyed up there at night, and I submit, Mr. Morton, that it must stop. I suggest we take a key upstairs, the pair of us, and have a look inside. I don't have a key to number 16, said the landlord. Mr. Finch couldn't hide his astonishment. Do you mean to say that you don't have a spare key to one of your own rooms? Mr. Morton, I do, enunciated the landlord. Mr. Finch became uncomfortably aware of one particular eye, rheumy and bloodshot, booing at him. Belligerently, the man in number 16 is no lodger of mine. Mr. Finch, he came with the house and is none of my business or yours. I don't believe I understand, Mr. Morton. I couldn't care less. Mr. F.E.I. Mr. Finch thought of something else, and that's another thing. Why is it that you're prepared to do the rounds for everybody knocking on their doors for their rent money, while I have to come down here to pay mine? This seems a little unfair, doesn't it? I never go on the top floor, Mr. Mr. Finch, and don't plan to change me habits. I don't need any trouble around here, for reasons you'll no doubt understand. And I'd advise you to keep your nose to yourself if it's a cheap roof over your head you want. That's all I got to say on it. And that's that. Back on the top floor, Mr. Finch stooped to the keyhole of room 16, but all he could see was the corner of the table in the gloom. The strange rubber thing had gone. Then he tried the room, and something unexpected happened. It opened. The room seemed to have been left for his inspection. He opened the door wider and stepped to the threshold of the room. A timid peer revealed the occupant to be absent. The object that stole his attention was the table in the middle of the room, or at least the filthy machinery that it supported. Apart from this, the room was a little furnished. There was a battered wardrobe at one end, and curtains of grimy cobwebs hung on each side of the little window. The thick carpet of dust was badly scuffed around the room. There was a wookak of old sacks, and God knew what else, in the room. The sight of the mangle made Mr. Fai feel ill. It was bolted on the table excessively, and the table was extensively strutted underneath with ironwork. And itself was bolted to the floor. The rollers were almost as big as dustbins. One of them was set into the table with only about 3 in protruding, while the height of the other appeared to be adjustable. An adjustable flap of rubber hung against the upper roll on the output side. Covering the gap beneath a badly stained gutter ran round the far side of the table at an angle, and a battered, filthy-looking bucket stood underneath its end, covered with a ragged scrap of mat. The whole contraption was perhaps the most repulsive thing he had ever seen. Gingerly, Mr. Finch entered the room. The electric lighting consisted of stripped wires hanging uselessly in cobwebs from a hole in the ceiling, and Mr. Finch supposed that the furry mass of cobwebs by the wardrobe must be the slot meter. The wardrobe contained a dirty pile of sacks and 2 slugs. It also contained dozens of crudely fashioned wax-like objects that resembled the half-used candle he found under a window. An oddity welded onto an enamel plate in its own wax. There was a primitive tinder box on the windowsill with blobs of dirt all over it. Mr. Finchfeth could see no signs of his threatening note anywhere. He wondered why he'd been allowed in, or if the occupant had simply slipped up outside. It was raining hard. The monotonous murmurs and mutterings of it had been a constant companion for Mr. F. All morning he looked idly out of the window, though he couldn't see very clearly through the rain patterns on the glass, the flat gray wash of the courtyard, and the green of the trees. Beyond were discernible. Sometimes even these were obliterated. When sudden gusts of wind lashed the back of the house with rain, Mr. Fincheth began to suspect that through the rivulets of water on the GL glass he could make out an unexpected form near the trees. By the abandoned cemetery, he pressed his nose against the glass and peered into the rain. He could hardly see much better, and the condensation on this side of the glass, caused by his breath, wasn't helping much. It was unquestionably a man. He looked bloodless, large and repulsively fat, and seemed to have something black and shiny, perhaps an oil skin in one mushy-looking hand. Mr. Finch did not think the head should look as mushy and featureless as it did. He became overwhelmed with a giddy sickness at the sight of the man. The man was gazing up the back of the house, and the possibility that he was aware of Mr. Fay's peering at him from the window of room 16 could not be discounted. Mr. Finch ducked out of sight. Perhaps he was being imaginative. But if the mysterious man in room 16 looked like anything, surely he would look like that thing outside, like some kind of maggot that crawled out of the soil to commit obscene crimes amongst humanity at night. Mr. Finch believed that he had been discovered in his snooping by the very man who occupied the room. Perhaps it had been a smell in the room. Or perhaps Mr. Finch was overreacting. But for the rest of that day, he felt very ill indeed and confined himself to his room. With the door locked, his illness seemed, if anything, to worsen as night drew in, he had seated himself on the square of hardboard that served to protect his backside from the vicious springs of his gutted armchair. He sat like this until late into the night, unable to move, the cold dampness of the climate drenching him to his bones. Late that night, Mr. Finch was roused from his stupor by the sound of a slow, heavy tread on the top of the stairs and a vaguely familiar wheezing noise. Mr. Finch listened, barely breathing, as the tread proceeded. Down the landing, the wheezing sound getting louder. It passed room 60 and came towards the only other door at this end, that of Mr. Fei. The tread stopped outside Mr. Finch's door, and nothing could be heard for a bit, except the wheezing. Mr. Finch, in the neon-lit gloom of his room, remained frozen, where he sat numbed with terror and dismay. His visitor then began to grope on the surface of the door. The sound of this was horribly soft and unmethodical. Soon the door handle was struck a couple of times, then turned as the door strained and cracked behind him. Mr. Finch shrieked without restraint. Rotten bits of wood spat out from around the lock and scattered on the floor, and as the door split under a sickening stench of wet soil and dead cats invaded the room. In common with Mr. Fifth's life, his disappearance passed unnoticed by the world in which he lived. His screams wandered along all the dark corridors of the house for over a minute, but no one stirred some. 50 minutes later, the tread of a descender could have been heard on the stairs, and a bronchial wheezing, which some of the lodgers might have noticed before in the house. But nobody reported it to the police. A suspicious lodger on the ground floor might have been able to furnish the police with a description of the descender, since the hall light, unlike those of the upper corridors and the stairs, was kept in serviceable order, and it remained switched on day and night. But the hall was deserted when the man on the stairs arrived. No one was there to see the descender in such detail, or to smell the appalling reek of corruption that hung around him. And no one was there to connect the screams with the hideous burden that he had slung over his shoulder. A filthy oilskin sack which had in it something half as massive and heavy. Something that filled the sack like laundry and meat. You might be one of those people like me who doesn't like the stories to be interrupted with ads out. And this podcast has ads on it. However, there is a solution. If you would like access to the stories without ads, and a link to a library of all the stories I've ever done that you can download without ads, you can get that by becoming a patron. So if you join for $5 or the equivalent in your currency a month, you can have all the stories, ad-free. So consider becoming a P-Go-To www.patreon. patreon.com. B-Kid, B-A-R-C-U-D. So that was The Lodger in Room 16 by David Dixon. Now, I got this from an anthology, anthologized by Mary Danby, one of 3 volumes that I have. This one's called 65. Great Spine Chillers, actually published by St. Michael, which was a publishing arm of Marks and Spencer's back in the early 80s, and Mary Danby was one of the great anthologies of horror stories and a writer in her own right. Of course, a successful author in her own right. For a long time, I associated her with Richard Dolby, who did another. He was another great anthologize of ghost stories in the same period. And I misread him, as I misread them as having the same name, and in my mind they were married, but they're not obviously. They maybe don't even know each other. I suspect they do know each other anyway. Enough of that. So, David Dixon, let's say something about David Dixon, that is, I don't know anything about him. So I found this story on page 209 in that volume I just talked about when I looked at the credits, because it's in copyright. I would imagine still, it wasn't reprinted by Mary Danny from any other. It was a permission of the author. I've looked for him on Amazon and on the internet, and I can't find him. possibly because David Dixon is a relatively common name. And there are lots of David Dixons, but they're mostly David C. Dixon. There's even a kind of dark fantasy writer called David Dixon, but I don't think it's the same guy. If you know who he is, retrospectively, I'd like his permission to do the story, and I'll tell you what. I'll split the proceeds half and half with him, although I would advise him not to shell out too much on in anticipation. Maybe a large latte and a blueberry muffin his half might buy that. So you might say, Tony, why you doing another copyright story and you just had your face punched for copyright issues? Well, I would love permission to use it, and because I think it's a really important story in many ways, even though I don't know anything to say about him. I'd like to know about him, but let's talk about where this story fits. So, on the face of it, it's an 80s story, potentially. It feels like it might be set in the 80s or the 70s or the 60s or the 50s or the 40s, as we'll say more about that. Let's look at what was happening in horror, was the so-called splatter punk, which is an American phenomenon. Think about people like Poppy Z. Bry, David J. Show, John Skip C. Spector. And so what this was about, it erupted out of the Gentile sort of ghost story. Hammer horror of the 50s. They're sort of very British, but it's splatterpunk is a very American thing. And transgressive, sort of provocative, lots of gore, and it's against the cinema background, where we're having lots of gory chainsaw massacres and grossness in the films. Not my favorite thing. Really, and mutilation disease, torture, often sexual pornographic things, flirting with gender identities in some cases, so it's grim is my point. At the same time we see, and I think it's a false friend. When you're learning languages, as I'm doing at the moment, because that's on my mind, you have false friends words that look like a word, and you think, that's what that means, and it doesn't. So if we look at what was happening in the UK around the same period, but with roots going further back, we have people like Ramsey Campbell. We have people like Ian Banks's The Wasp Factory. We have Clive Barker's Books of Blood and Hellraiser. And they seem to fit pretty neatly. Maybe Campbell, let's put him slightly to one side. But certainly many of these stories, certainly Books of Blood, and The Wasp Factory are grim, violent tales. Ian Banks is Wasp Factory because it's in a Scottish landscape. And I think that's a key point here. Hellraiser has its roots. Barker's work has its roots in fantasy. There's a lot of fantasy in it. But the point is where this story, the David Dixon story, fits in is, if we look at it, it's this grim story it's the graphic, isn't the viance, isn't particularly described graphically, but it's certainly there. And the impression is that people are being mangled to death. And so it's definitely that shockness which I think has some things in common with the American splatterpunk, and certainly the Wasp Factory, and lots of other stuff that was going on. And I think some of Campbell's work, Ramsey Campbell's work, be shockingly like that. But they also have this, and also some of Neil Gaughan's work I was going to mention. Neil Gaiman, his stuff like Feeders and Eaters, which is about what it suggests, has that grossness. That is, that we see in this story, we see in some of Ramsey Campbell's work, this quite unpleasant graphical violence, or illusions to gray graphical violence. What's in your mind is not just somebody getting a slap. It's kind of pretty gruesome. But the point I'm making, Gaiman, like Clive Barker, more so than Clive Barker, is interested in the mythological and the fantastical and the fairy worlds, and he tends to, but the Sandman, that also had that kind of flirting, particularly the recent series, the flirting with gender and things like that. Although something that's produced in the 2020s, we probably shouldn't compare with the 90s, so of the 80s, rather the early Bemasa. Autumn Chasai's turned on 80s, and because probably the Sandman film series is a product of the 2020s, despite having its roots much earlier in his work. So, yes, that's true. It can be seen as a sister to American splatterpunk, but this grim, and also actually as I was reading it, I was thinking of Lovecraft stories like The Rats in the Walls, or particularly the music of Eric Zahn. These tumble-down, horrible H houses, or the dreams in the witch house. Particularly this lodging house with all sorts of strange stuff going on in it, so, yeah. So that it's like a glitter ball, isn't it? In a disco, where it's the light splinters all over. So there's echoes of Lovecraft. There's echoes of American splatter punk, but there's also echoes of this grim portrayal of British working class, or non-working class, poverty and deprivation, as we might call it now. That is very characteristic of these kind of stories. They're set in this 1980s grimness of Britain, that is, in Scotland, is a schemes being councillor states. I think they call them projects in the U.S., where people with no hope and no money and, are left to rot, basically. Maybe that's unfair on some of the political politicians' attempts to make things better. It's an easy shot to say they're just liars and cheating, but let's be charitable and say that, some of the politicians, local politicians, whatever, did want to make these things better for people anyway. And what I also see in this is Robert Amon, before things like the hospice things, like ringing the changes. So the hospices, he goes to this bizarre, very English, weird, motel hotel on the edge of town, where people eat a lot, and he gets bricked in a bedroom with a man in pajamas. And of course, ring the changes when they go to this very recognizably GC Coast out of season hotel, where you can imagine your feet sticking to the carpets, and that has bizarre resonance, and whereas Amon certainly isn't graphically violent like this, there are echoes, and he's much earlier, He's 50, 60, so my point is that I am in that period. I was just reading a book about Harold Wilson by Alan Johnson, and talking about the films, The Angry Young Men, about these in the 50s, about working class people fighting against privilege, and they live in grim, squalid places. It's always rainy and grim. And of course, I think this story makes a fantastic use of the British weather. I think I was, whatever, I think I've been hot. I live in the north of England, of course, once 2 days in the past 3 years. Even last summer, I spent last summer with my coat and hat on, And that is not untypical. And so this sense of the gray, the damp cold, there was a YouTube thing of this American guy gone to Glasgow and was saying how, it's not cold in the sense of Canada or Siberia, but it's this damp cold, whereas, when it gets really cold, I don't know, 'cause I don't live in those places, but I understand. It's like the dry heat, isn't it? There's no moisture in the air. It's more tolerable. It's not very tolerable, but it's more tolerable. Whereas we have this damp, clinging grayness that goes on for week after week, and is really, really depressing. I don't know if you're picking that up from my voice. I've had a cold I haven't got a cold, but my voice, you can probably hear it squeaking anyway. So when we look at this, the state of sort of even Amon, but certainly these 80s stories of the grimness of how Britain is for many people, I'm not trying to run the place down either. I think it's got a lot going for it. I wish we would think of that. I wish we would remember that, actually, but certainly we have wallowed in this grossness, this horribleness. I'll go and I say, and we might call it my last point here, is we might call it po-imperial. So Britain, after the Second World War, was bankrupted by the cost of fighting him. And remember, standing alone at some point against not Germany, And you don't want to make a point, but it's something like, we lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers while the Germans and the Soviets were still allies. Anyway, there we go. Did a little bit of patriotism there. When we look back at things like Frederick Engels in the 19th century, he wrote a book called The Conditions of the English Working Class, or The Condition of the Working Class in England, which shows the utter poverty of. And this was at the height of empire, the utter poverty and degrading conditions of the working class. So I think there's ever since, and probably, even the rural workers probably had a pretty hard time as well. But certainly ever since there's been an industrialization, there has been this. So I think to say it's just a post-industrial or post-imperial is to miss the point. The conditions of poor people in England and in Scotland and in Wales and, even they may not like me to say it in Ireland as well, fairly grim. They might not all me to say, because they might not think I have a right to say it, as it's an independent country, and Northern Ireland, of course, is part of the United Kingdom. Oh, it's political, isn't it? I was conscious of that, talking about Neil Gaiman. It's like walking on hot potatoes, so. But I'm going to determine to skirt all of those things. But my point is, and I've made my point again, although we may call this a late 20th century, it's still true for people now. It was true for people when Engels was writing about them. So ever since there have been industrialized cities, and now post-industrial cities, there's been this grim life. But I think David Dixon, coming back to David Dixon, I gave him a lot of credit for using the weather to convey this soul-deadening, damp grimness. And of course he uses the environmental descriptions of the cobweb room, the feel, the dust carpet, the filth, and the fact this guy, the dustbins, he knocks a dustbin over, he goes to get his dole, which is of course his social security money. So this man has no jube, he goes to the LI. Lista was a library that had books then, and he uses that. The social so incense he's so. Let's jump aside slightly and look at the purpose of this writer. So he's not writing a love story. If he was writing a love story, I know this is an American story, but he might write 500 Days of Summer. And it was all sunny, and they're going for dates, and I know it all breaks down, but oh, sorry if that's a spoiler, but it's a different kind of story. If he was writing a spy novel, also many British spy novels, John L. Carr, Graham A. Greene, etc., were grim, not Fleming, of course, not Ian Fleming, but lived this grim gray world. The writer uses whatever kind of world he wants to convey the emotion he wants. So remember saying, many times, stories are emotion machines. They are intended to create feelings in you, the listener, the reader. So if I was writing a love story, I would in the same city that David Dixon said this story, I wouldn't put in that part. I put in, place where they could go to Italian restaurants and they went skating or something, and it was all lovely. In the end, it was lovely. So we may say that this is a commentary of how it is, but it's not. It's an artifice. And maybe, and there are places like this without, I can go and walk my dog through them, within 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 10 minutes. Actually, I can, if I walk straight over. I'm not going to say where it is, but we have to remember that this is not how Britain is. Although, we could write a thesis, a PhD thesis, about how all this kind of grim horror reflects the true reality of suffering of poor people in Britain. Yeah, absolutely, but at the same time, in the same city, there are love stories being written, There are spy stories being written, and the author selects those situations. So no, none. This is true. It's like that mirror ball, isn't it? It just reflects a facet of people's experience. Because even we hope you know. We hope that if this man had gone a different way on a spring day, like I've just been, there's been some sunshine, not sunshine like you get, but sun behind only about 3 layers of clouds, so it wasn't completely dark and gray. But I went out, and there were the snowdrops are still out there, were crocuses, which is my favorite flower. And I even saw some daffodils first. 3 daffodils. I mean, it was really cold. I did have my hat and gloves on and my coat. But you know, this guy could have gone on a nice walk in a park and seeing some ducks, because it's very hard to be depressed in a world that has ducks. If you failed a bit down, just go and watch some ducks. Just watch them doing their duck thing. And I'm sure it'll help anyway, so it's a pity. I don't know more about David Dixon. I would like to know more about him if he's still alive and still writing. Please encourage him to get in touch, and I will give him half of what I make on this, which again won't be a lot of money. But you know, that's not why we do it. And answering my point, why do another story that may be in copyright and maybe get in trouble? Because I think it's a story that deserves to be heard. Because I think it says interesting things, or it allows me to say interesting things anyway. There we are, okay. I hope you're well, hope everything is good. I'm going to now edit this, what you edit it to the sound of Led Zeppelin 2. Everybody dies, don't they? Let some come back, isn't that so? You tried to get into the lock, doctor, didn't you? How did the date come back? Mother, what's the secret? It's coming back, want back, yes. God help you, I do, yes. Everybody dies, don't they? Some come back, isn't that?